So far, we spoke about the actual Ruby language. Now, it turns out, in addition to the core Ruby language, there's also much more available to you. There are all these packages called Ruby gems available to help you do your job as a Ruby developer. So if you want to know what they are, you could go to rubygems.org and search for all different functions and different gems that are out there. And when you install Ruby, you also get this gem command line utility that helps you install and deal with your Ruby gems, Ruby packages. So it says that it's a Ruby gems, it's a sophisticated package manager for Ruby. So we're going to be taking a look at a gem called HTTParty, and to be able to install it, you just do gem install HTTParty, and HTTParty will install itself as well as the dependencies that it needs to do its job. So you could see here that it's installing multi-XML, MIME types, and so on. Now, once it's installed, you could do gem list HTTParty, and you'll see the local versions of a gem installed. So if you have multiple versions installed, you'll see a list of them listed here. Another useful option is the -D option for detail, and it will tell you more information about the particular gems. In this case, it will tell you the authors, the homepage, the license, and it will also tell you what this thing actually does. So in the case of HTTParty, it makes HTTP fun, also makes consumer RESTful web services dead easy. Okay? So in essence, HTTParty is a RESTful web services client. Provides support for basic HTTP authentication, default request query parameters, and most importantly, it provides support for automatic parsing of JSON and XML into Ruby hashes based on response content type. So what are these things we just mentioned? RESTful web services, what is that? So we're going to be taking a closer look at REST in general later in the semester, but for now, RESTful web services are basically web services implemented using HTTP and principles of REST. And the idea is that you have a base URI, like a URL, and you have some kind of a format, like a data exchange format, like XML or JSON, and it supports a set of HTTP operations like get and post. So I guess a high level of what this thing does, for you to think about it, is instead of going to a web page and just seeing HTML, you're actually hitting a web URL and you're getting back some kind of a format that's easy for a machine to interpret. So maybe JSON or XML, and it's something that's easy to parse. And also, if you want to make a post, right? So if you want to provide some information back to the website, you would use a post, and if you want to just get some information, you use a get. And there are a lot of RESTful APIs out there. You could go to anyapi.com, for example, and see all the different kinds of RESTful APIs that websites provide in addition to their regular HTML pages. Okay, so how do you actually use this HTTParty? Turns out it's very easy. You just have to include the HTTParty module, and you're good to go. And then you could specify the base URI that you want to hit. You could specify the default params. So default params are usually things that apply to every single request. So for example, let's say a website, a web services website makes you include the API developer key. So instead of having to write that for every request that you make in your class, you just have one line that says always include this API developer key as a default param. And then you could also specify format, which sometimes HTTParty is smart enough to figure it out, but if you want to help it out, you could say, I'm using this particular format, whether it's XML or JSON. Nowadays, most web services out there support JSON mostly, and some also support XML. And this also helps a lot with a dry principle, which is don't repeat yourself. You have the least amount of code to get your job done. So let's take a concrete example. There's a website out there called whoismyrepresentative.com, and if you do /API, it will tell you that it has an API for this website as well. And so you could get the members of representatives, you could get the senators, and you could pass certain parameters, for example, based on a zip code. And you also see here that if you attach the @output equals JSON, it will give you this data in the JSON format. So what does that actually look like? So basically, your base URI is this, whoismyrepresentative.com, and then you have a specific request. So this is get all members, and then you pass a request parameter for a particular zip code, which is 21208, and then you also specify another request parameter that says output should be JSON, so you get this data back in the JSON format. So what comes back is a JSON object, that's what these curlies mean, that have one key. The key is results, and that the value of that key is an array of all the different representatives, where each one of them is an object, right? So the whole thing is a JSON object that contains one key. That key contains an array, and inside the array is made up of more JSON objects that have a name, party, state, and so on. So you could see that JSON looks very similar to a Ruby hash, and what HTTParty lets you do is parse this information into a Ruby hash. So how would you actually implement this? It's very simple. So after you install HTTParty, you actually require HTTParty, the gem. So this is required in the HTTParty gem. And then your class includes the HTTParty module. And then you could specify base URI is this, and then default params. Now, in the default params, you're saying that your output is JSON. So this is just a request parameter that's going to be added to every single request out there. So as we saw, that you have to specify output equals JSON as a request parameter. The next line is format JSON. This has nothing to do with the actual request that you make out there. So it's not part of a request parameter, but this is just telling HTTParty that, by the way, the stuff coming back is going to be JSON. So this line is a request parameter telling the web service out there which format you would like based on the documentation of a web service. And this format JSON is you telling the HTTParty gem that, by the way, the stuff coming back is JSON. And then you could have these separate methods. Yeah, these are class methods. So for example, you could have a method called get senators by state, which lets you pass in the state. And then you have get. So get is it's something that HTTParty understands as a get request. You specify the stuff that goes in addition to the base URI. So you're always going to have a base URI, but then you're also going to have / the actual thing that goes after the base URI. And then the second parameter to this get thing is the actual query, the request parameters. So in this case, the request parameters are state equals a state that you pass in. So if you saw, actually in this case, it happens to be, there's a zip code, but also there's also an option to pass state as well. So for example, it's not shown here, but that's basically how it's done. So you have state, and you pass in the state. And the same thing for representatives, you pass in the query of state. So how you actually use that is you say Congress representation dot get senators by state. You pass in the MD for state. Now what comes back is this thing over here, a hash that actually has results as the key. So you want to actually specify that you want to get the content of that, the guts of what you get back, results. So if you want to print this out, what you get back is an array of Ruby hash objects inside of it. So you have an array of, where each individual thing in the array is the object, which is basically a hash with parameters like, with properties like name, party, state, and so on.